All right, welcome everybody. This is another edition of the Advocacy and Policy podcast brought to you by the Arnold and Porter Legislative and Public Policy team. I'm Kevin O'Neill, a partner here in the Legislative and Policy Group, joined by two of my colleagues. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Allison.
Hi, Allison Jarus, new to the firm, policy advisor here at Arnold and Porter.
Hello, Ron Kine, senior counsel at the firm, 26-year member of the House, and trying to figure out the shutdown.
We're also joined by a special guest today from Punchbowl News, Samantha Handler. If you're not familiar with Punchbowl, it's probably one of the go-to things for our team and everybody in Washington to stay plugged in on all things Capitol Hill and the Trump administration. Samantha, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we want to start with you and get the latest on the shutdown update on the Capitol Hill.
Right, so things look this week so far is a lot like they did last week. The House is still out of session. The Senate has once again rejected the House passed CR with no new Democratic defections. But, we are hearing, there's some more discussions about what does an off-ramp look like. Of course, that's because they have to start talking about this more seriously now, because even the CR that the House did pass runs up to November 21st. And that deadline is fast approaching. So, it looks like they would have to even amend that CR at this point. So I don't know if these off-ramp discussions are necessarily a good sign or a sign that they're getting out of it. But, something needs to change, and senators know that.
Leave it to Congress to build a highway with no off-ramp. So, Ron, you spent 26 years in Congress. It's an odd moment in history. The routine for shutdown kind of gets out of order. Tell us about your experience, what it's like to be a member in all these.
This shutdown feels different because both sides feels they have the high moral ground. There seems to be no concessions from either side. There doesn't seem to be any serious discussions taking place even behind the scenes. I know, having gone through a few of these shutdowns myself, it soon becomes a pox on both houses because for the average Americans, it's the bottom line, which is how's this impacting my pocketbook? And that's what they're going to be focused on. They're not going to be looking to cast blame right now, other than your ardent partisans. And typically when these shutdowns occur, it's off election year. They have very little impact on the next election cycle. Typically because it's usually resolved at a reasonable length. But now we're in the day 21, second longest shutdown in our nation's history. We're probably going to blow past the record, which is 35 days during the first Trump administration. And there really doesn't seem to be an off-ramp right now being offered. But there are key pressure points that I'm sure we can talk about that will increase the pressure on members that get them into serious negotiation mode.
So, Allison, most of your career was spent working for House appropriators, the people at the center of this, along with House and Senate leadership. Again, it's a different shutdown. Tell us a little bit about the mindset of appropriators, what they're trying to accomplish right now, and what their frustrations are right now.
I think it's interesting in this particular moment, certainly given the externals, but also the internals of the committee. Because there was a time when appropriations was its own party, the old cliche, the three parties in Congress, Republicans, Democrats, and appropriators.
The Green Party.
Of course. And while the committee itself certainly still wields significant power in terms of the process, the influence that they have has been diluted. And that has not only happened over this shutdown in this particular Congress, but that's been a trend that's been ongoing for maybe arguably decades, but certainly over the past 15 years or so. So I think that appropriators still fancy themselves as quite important. I think that they still see themselves as quite necessary. But the reality is that so many of the chairs and ranking members have much more to give to their top leadership, and that goes to the top of the committee, and then the top of the committee goes to their party leadership. When I was a young staffer working for appropriations, many times we would actually negotiate our bills ourselves. And as I advanced in my career, the amount of times that ended up in a speaker or leader's office multiplied. So I think that there is an unusual level of the technical expertise still exists amongst those chairs and rankers and certainly their staffs, but the ability to actually negotiate their own bills has been diluted. And if they could do it themselves, I think that we could get out of it faster because they have counterparts that they actually know and trust, even in these toxic partisan times. And it's a different moment for appropriations.
Ron and Samantha, do you want to comment on that dynamic that things are sort of narrowing over time to just a handful of people getting to make all the decisions?
Yeah, I was always, Kevin, a big believer in getting back to regular order and let the process work its will and let the committees do their work. And for decades now, it's really been more and more top-down management where leadership is dictating what the agenda is, what decisions are being teed up, and it's diluting the power of these committees, whether it's Ways and Means, my former committee, appropriations that Allison worked on, and it makes for a less fun work environment for members to show up because they have very little input on what's getting scheduled and what's ultimately getting decided upon. And the sooner we can restore that regular order, I think we're going to be able to avert these type of shutdowns in the future, because it's really at the committee level where that trust, which is the coin of the realm on Capitol Hill, gets formed, and you can work across the aisle and find out those areas of common ground that you can work on together.
What's your sense? Do you think things are narrowing?
Yeah, I mean, I think appropriators in particular are frustrated. I was talking to Senator John Kennedy the other day, and he said, I'd prefer to have a seat on finance, paraphrasing, of course.
I'm sure he said it much more
Much more,
interestingly.
yeah, with a thicker accent, right? But he said, why get a seat on appropriations anymore where we've been sidelined? There's just CRs and rescissions packages. They're really frustrated. If it was up to appropriators, they would have had this done and they could have come to a deal. And we saw the leaders of the appropriations committees on both sides of the aisle really calling for that in September. They kept saying, we need our leadership to get together and start talking about appropriations, and that just never happened.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to talk a little bit about that. Punchbowl does a great job of always telling us both the short-term and long-term historic perspective of some of these fights. And I wanted to go back to when Ron was a new member of Congress, because I felt like then there was a little more functionality in the appropriations process, what Allison was saying. So I went and looked at 1999. Ron, I think you were a freshman or a sophomore in 99. And the reason I looked at 99 and the fiscal year 2000 process was it was the start of my professional career, but was also very similar to this Congress. We had an impeached president in his second term. We had a very closely divided but all Republican Congress, right? So they had about a 13-seat majority in that Congress in the House. They have a single-digit majority in the House now. They had a 5-seat majority in the Senate. Now they've got a 3-seat majority. And yet they managed to do the two big things: pass the National Defense Authorization Act and pass all the appropriations bills. And what's fascinating about that is they did it. Clinton vetoed 4 appropriations bills that year, but they still got all the appropriations bills to the finish line and signed by Thanksgiving weekend. Some of those passed with massive majorities. Ron might remember some of those, like labor age, passed by single digits in the House and just a couple of votes in the Senate. But they got it done. And the NDAA was actually signed into law the first week of October. And that's kind of, you look at that and you say, well, we functioned then, even though things were partisan.
Kevin, I would submit that one reason it worked was because the old Bulls were very protective of their jurisdiction. You look at Jack Murtha, and he was ranking on defense appropriations, and he didn't let anything slide. He was determined to get it done, and he was willing to work in a bipartisan fashion. On the appropriation side, you had Livingston and Obey, who trusted each other, worked well together, but very protective of that appropriations jurisdiction. And they weren't going to be dictated upon. So they were able to continue doing the work, even in the midst of repeated shutdowns. And members understood that, and they understood what role that they were going to play, including more junior members who felt that they had input, again, through the committee process.
So those junior members, I went and looked at, there's only 31 House members and 13 senators who were in Congress back then, when we had a semi-functional process that got done relatively on time. So that's 8% of the House, which means 92% of the House and Senate has only existed in this dysfunctional era. And that's why we've got 3 spending bills that have come out of the House, 2 in the Senate, and nothing has gotten to the finish line. We're way, way behind. So let's take that and kind of look at the bigger picture here. I see us having a big existential fight in D.C. between a president who's focused on unitary power, unitary executive, consolidating a lot of things, and some in Congress, not all, who want to reserve the rights that they have, the prerogatives, especially the power of the purse, against DOJ and pocket rescissions, closing agencies, layoffs. Ron, I want to go back to you. You're just talking about the old bulls. How you are talking to members every day. How do they feel about this fight between the two branches of government over the power of the purse?
Well, obviously, this does break along partisan lines. The Democrats are still very protective of their Article 1 constitutional responsibilities, being a co-equal branch, a check and balance, and they feel not enough oversight's being done, not enough pushback on what the president is asserting and the decisions that he's making. I think you have a lot of squeamish Republicans, to be fair, that are also worried about their role in the constitutional scheme. But they don't have the ability right now to stand up to the president and his decision-making, mainly because of their base. And I don't want to lay all the blame on the shoulders of members of Congress. A lot of this deals with the American people and how tribal we've become and how unforgiving they are of their members to try to work in a bipartisan manner, trying to find common ground, where today you're more likely to get punished politically for trying to do that, especially given all the gerrymandering that's taking place around the country, where it's overwhelmingly Democrat or Republican districts. So by definition, there's no incentive for those members to try to work in a bipartisan way to make the institution work the way our founders envisioned it. So the American people need to be the ultimate judge and referee in all this, and what type of government they want, what type of process they're going to be subjected to. And right now, there's staunch partisans on both sides.
So, Samantha, you walk these halls every day. It seems like there's less members in town now to catch in the hall, but you and the Punchbowl News seem to do a great job of getting very direct comments from people about the experience. What is the frustration? And we keep using the word off-ramp. What are members talking about?
Yeah, it's very quiet on Capitol Hill. No tours, no House members, which really brings a lot of life back to the building. But senators, as we've said, are really frustrated with this process. They're frustrated with that fight between the legislative branch and executive branch. And there's some discussions going on, right? There's a bipartisan group of members who insist, of senators rather, who insist that it's not a negotiation. They're just talks. And they're working through, how can we get to something on the ACA tax credits, which have been at the center of this funding fight. But it's not clear that anything they come up with could pass the House. And I think it's not entirely clear, if that would be enough for Democrats of just getting a vote in the Senate and getting a vote in the House that fails, if that is satisfactory, or if they need an actual policy win here. And I think that's what that's the question that has to be answered over the next few weeks is, what is a win for Democrats in this scenario? Is it just a political win, or do they need something policy-wise to get out of this?
And Kevin, I would submit that what isn't helpful right now is Speaker Johnson's decision to keep the House out of session, because normally in past shutdowns, both houses were in session. It gave the members a chance to talk to each other in the hallways, in the House gym, or wherever they might meet. And that pressure tends to build from the bottom up on leadership too, saying, all right, what's the off-ramp? I mean, what do we need to do to get this place open again? And that's just not, those conversations just aren't happening. When I was serving, I was the leader of the New Dem Coalition. We have like 100 members on the Democratic side. And I made it a point of scheduling meetings with the Republican Main Street group, the Tuesday group. I think they call themselves the Republican Governing Group today, a more pragmatic group of House Republicans, just to talk to each other to find out if there is some resolution. We drove leadership crazy by doing it, because it was a bunch of backbenchers having these discussions amongst themselves, and leadership felt they were losing control. But it's that type of pressure that needs to start building internally that just isn't happening because members aren't in town. And then you have the external pressure points that will only continue to build and put more pressure on individual members, and that ultimately is going to lead to some resolution.
It's so interesting, and Allison, I want to get your perspective here in just a moment, your work from appropriators. When I talk to Republican offices and chiefs of staff in the last few days, their phone call traffic is pretty de minimis on this, and it's sort of equally divided between stand with Trump and give me my subsidies now and forever. And so they don't feel that pressure. And we were talking before the show, a lot of Republican members, because they're home, they're in the face of their constituents. And so the sense from the constituents is, we may not be in Washington, but you're here working. You're not sitting on the couch eating bonbons. But Allison, to this point that they're not together, that really exacerbates all the challenges the appropriator face, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's also not unrelated to the previous conversations, which is the change in dynamics that have allowed for not just the members to find this to be pretty palatable or normal or navigable, right? But also the American people, because they have become a more common practice. We were talking prior to the show in the group just about the difference between a partial and full government shutdown. Technically, this is a full government shutdown in the sense that every single agency is closed, all 12 bills have not passed, and yet we are still flying and we are still paying our military through potentially questionable legal means that will come to a head down the line. But in the short term, some of those questions are not answered. So I think there is a relevance there that is kind of fascinating to explore. On the appropriations side, to Ron's point, you can't really have a committee pass their quote unquote bill or portions of their bill if they're not in town. So I think that there is a real drive by the committee to get back in the room. They don't have the kind of culture that they had in 1999 or in 1985 or in the previous years where they would have many lived in DC or would have had those friendships or different relationships, right? Those things on the House side especially have certainly atrophied. And I think that the lack of being in town presents a real challenge to when I actually see my counterparts. And because they're so new, some of those relationships are a lot less historical. At the leadership level of the committee, certainly those are historical because you have senior members who've known each other for many years and decades. But at the actual committee level, I would argue that those relationships are much less robust.
So Samantha started talking about the parameters of a deal. And Allison, I want to start with you and then we'll come to Samantha. But let's get on the table. What are sort of the wish list of Democrats and then what are the wish list of Republicans? Is there a way to make those Venn diagrams overlap?
Well, I think that there are contours of a deal that exist, to Samantha's point about what the senators in particular have been discussing. They're not formalized and they have not been vetted. And I think that's a real key because any early negotiation has not been able to have the sunlight on it yet. So it's easy for us to talk about that would say, oh, it's very easy to get to 1, 2, and 3 until a voting base sees it or until an outside organizer sees it, right? And there's a couple of things that really have popped in those negotiations that will have pressure points, particularly on the Democratic side, but I think also on the Republican side. Clearly, the entire fight centers around the ACA enhanced tax credits and subsidies. And I think that a true deal will center on the poverty level income caps, right? If we're able to have a discussion, which Democratic some leaders and other members have opened the door to publicly and privately having a discussion about exploring what the income cap formula ultimately looks like. There's conversations on the Republican side, certainly around a means testing component. That's a ACA old school redo that we're going to bring back, but that's going to be an opportunity for ours to really raise in service of their broader healthcare policy agenda that maybe has not been getting the type of oxygen that it would have in a traditional Republican administration. That's clearly a non-starter in these negotiations for Democrats, but it would be an important benchmark for Republicans to lay down in their healthcare goals. There's conversations around grandfathering and around new enrollees and some of those components. And then I think potentially what would be normally perceived, especially Ron, I would be curious for your thoughts from a member that was in an interesting district on the Hyde Amendment, which ACA has sort of wiggled around for many years. I would argue, maybe this is news, that there are a certain subset of Democrats that would swallow that provision on ACA to get out of the shutdown. The question then becomes what the outside pressure points look like on something that in many Democratic circles is taken as fairly sacrosanct. However, there is a lot of precedent for coming in and out of a majority and making changes to Hyde.
So Samantha, what are we missing? What are the big deal points that you hear out there?
Yeah, I think outside of the ACA credits, the other big issue for Democrats is really the rescissions issue, right? And that's something appropriators want. They want some commitment that if you come to a deal on a funding bills, which that's a whole other thing, right? Is, appropriators are not ready. If they come to the bipartisan funding agreements that Trump and OMB Director Russ Vought aren't going to just disregard that, right? Which has been happening, and that's also been a piece of the shutdown. And that's a piece that, I think is really going to be difficult to navigate. And I don't think it's clear where that may end up. All the conversations I've been hearing about have been really focused on the ACA credits. And, there's a lot of Republicans, too, who do want to see something happen on the expiring subsidies. Lisa Murkowski is one. She said since reconciliation was passed that she actually voted for that bill, partly because she thought she could get to a solution on the expiring ACA credits, and that would help smooth things over with some of her problems she had during reconciliation. So there's paths there, but I don't know what that looks like for on the rescissions side of it. Democrats want to see commitments from Republicans saying that they will not accept another rescissions package, and I haven't seen any Republicans get quite there yet.
Well, I would say normally in past shutdowns, what happens, you get a reasonable group of Republicans who get together, hammer out an agreement, take it to leadership, and then leadership has to understand that there's going to be blowback from the far right, far left, the extremes in their parties, and a willingness to stand up to that and bring that to the floor and cobble together a bipartisan majority in both the House and the Senate. So the real question today is leadership in a position to really stand up to the extremes in their parties, given how polarized our electorate is right now and the challenges they face maybe in their own reelection bids back home. And that's what I'm waiting to see play out here. But thus far, we're not even at that point yet where there's even the framework of some off-ramp in the Senate that can be offered to the House. Throw in the Hastert rule, which requires a majority of House Republicans to vote on anything, that complicates it even more.
The rescissions piece goes right back to the Article 1 conversation that we were having, which is so fundamental. So to go back to your kind of original question to me, Kevin, about what appropriators are going to do in their roles in the future, this is paramount, because that's the kind of issue that actually has massive impact across the electorate and across the bills, but is the type of thing that feels inside baseball to the committee. And how can you get Russ Vought to commit to not taking a rescissions package when he has spent the shutdown tweeting about the specific agencies? I mean, this is what the external forces are when we talk about why this is different. We don't typically have an OMB director saying we're going to stop funding the programs we've already funded in these 6 specific cities that have something in common, right? So I think that is certainly informing House members. To your point, Ron, there's reasonable people who just keep seeing the signals of we are not in a climate to take those hard votes. And I think it's also fundamental for them.
Well, I think one of the other problems is we can't even agree on the facts, which is a very common malady now in the policy process. Democrats spend a lot of time flagging the Kaiser Family Foundation results, which call for cataclysmic rises in premiums when the subsidies go away. And there were articles in this morning's papers talking about how big those increases could be in states, both battleground states like Georgia and Maine, where you've got vulnerable incumbents in both parties. And then on the converse side, there was a Wall Street Journal op-ed this morning that basically went under the hood on the KFF study and said, no, they're mixing they're mixing numbers. They're not really looking at what families will actually pay. And when you break it down, you're looking at $60 to $100 a month in increases for people if you get to that cap of under 250 poverty level, right? And I'm not sure how many programs get to providing subsidies for people at 250 to 400% of poverty level. But when you can't agree about the facts on the ground, it's really hard to agree about how we're going to have a solution here. So now one of the newest items that Punchbowl News is reporting on and others is that John Thune's saying, hey, this 7-week stopgap bill, we're already in week 4. We may have to do some other things. So how does that complicate things, Samantha?
I mean, it means the House would need to come back in session. I mean, whenever we're talking about, could the Senate pass a bill to pay the troops? Could the Senate pass a different CR, a longer CR? It all comes back to, well, the House needs to come back in session. Even when the Senate was voting last week on defense appropriations, which of course was the Senate version, there was no bipartisan version of that bill. The House would have had to come back in session to get that across the finish line. I mean, it also means that the conversation of a long-term CR has entered the conversation, right? Which, of course, again goes directly attacks the power of the Appropriations Committee. It's something Susan Collins really does not want. Something no Democratic appropriators want. It would be really, really difficult for appropriators to swallow. But if they can't get to a deal and there's really so little time left to get appropriations bills across the finish line, that will have to be, talked about. And maybe, we're talking about a CR now till March, or December, to put it slightly closer. But things are getting more complicated now. And I think the House will need to come back soon to deal with these issues.
We're in bizarro world. We have Mike Johnson and John Thune arguing for year 3 of Joe Biden's budget. So how's the House going to deal with this?
I think that I was thinking this exact thing as you were speaking, because you followed the House. You have a Freedom Caucus who's now asking for a long-term CR in order to get the president out of the shutdown, and you have a Democratic administration who has Democratic Congress members with Democratic numbers saying, no, we need to redo the process. It is totally upside down and fascinating to watch, especially as a person, recent Hill departure. Coming from the committee, our timeline was totally disrupted. There was no fiscal year when I was working in these offices. There was always a opportunity to move it into, September became December and December became March. And all of a sudden you start the process on this year's FY and you're still funding last year's. And so that has been highly convoluted for many years. And now this feels like, the real explosion of those dynamics. So yes, I think that is a very strange twist, and one that is informing, I would argue, probably leadership the most, probably Republican leadership the most, because some of the things that would have felt fairly obvious to them from a long-term political perspective in terms of how they actually viewed federal funding, that has been sort of blended up, and it's not as clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whatever the agreement is to open the government, it has to be more long-term. It can't be another short-term measure only to bring back the pain and the uncertainty. And the short-term CR that they keep referring to right now expires November 21. Speaker Johnson's argument that the House has done their job, there's no need for members to come back, we're waiting for the Senate to take, that's going to get old, and it's going to be a short ramp for him. So it will require asking the members to come back and hammer out a longer-term agreement. But in the meantime, paychecks aren't going out now, finally. The president's been moving some funds around, which will be very short term in order to pay the military, law enforcement, the WIC program, but that's going to expire real short. TSA and air traffic controllers are still showing up but not getting paid. That's going to wear thin. In past shutdowns, they tend to start calling in sick, and it starts disrupting air travel. That gets a lot of people ornery, and the political pressure builds from there, including members of Congress who have to fly a lot because of their jobs are going to start feeling this. The SNAP program, nutritional program, is about to expire from funding. That's going to increase. Even the NRCS programs for farm programs that farmers are desperate to try to get done before the end of the year are not going out. They're not being completed. So even in farm country, they're feeling the pressures of this shutdown. And all this comes to bear on individual members who will take these messages back to their leadership.
So that's a good segue. So we're kind of talking about the best case scenario. We get a longer term CR, get the shutdown ended. Let's go down the doomsday path, because you kind of tie a couple of these things together where it's being reported that the administration is looking to figure out how to pay air traffic controllers and TSA. And they've already shifted tariff money to WIC, and they've figured out a way to pay the military last week. And is there really a political appetite if at the end of the month we're nowhere on this deal, and Trump says, I have found money in the couch cushions to pay WIC, TSA, the military, law enforcement, and air traffic controllers, i.e. all the pain points that the American public is most likely to feel. And Democrats, Patty Murray, I can hear her already saying, oh, no, that's not legal. Who has the standing and who has the political gumption to actually sue and say, you can't pay the military and the air traffic controllers? Is that a possible scenario?
Well, I think that's the most dangerous lesson that can be learned from all of this is the president believing he doesn't have to work with Congress anymore. He can make these decisions unilaterally, move funds around. He thinks he has a giant slush fund with the tariff revenue that's being raised right now. And he thinks he has sole discretion and where to distribute that money. As Allison pointed out, he's playing this games where he's trying to punish blue districts and not red districts when it comes to funding issues and infrastructure projects and whatnot. And if he learns that lesson, then I think the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch becomes even more broken than it is today.
Samantha, you hearing anything about doomsdays?
I mean, there are lawsuits right now kind of on that topic, right? And so far, it seems like courts have said only the GAO has standing. I don't believe that's a binding decision. So, there's still other cases working through the process. But the GAO, of course, is shut down right now. So it's unlikely that they would bring anything anyway. And to your point, I don't know if there's really any appetite for someone to bring a lawsuit and say, hey, you can't pay the troops, right? That doesn't look great. In the same way, it doesn't look great if Democrats vote against the bill to pay the troops, which is, of course, the thinking for some of them. Others are saying, of course, they don't want to vote for a bill like that because they don't want to give Trump and Russ vote more power and more privilege to just move funds around. But yeah, I mean, that's part of this shutdown fight is people aren't feeling the pain. There's not been a big forcing mechanism. I also think after November 1st, which is when, with open enrollment, that deadline, the ACA fight becomes less urgent for Democrats, right? That's been their whole point of why we need to do this now in October. It's because of the November 1st deadline. And post November 1st, that's a harder item to sell.
And that goes back to your point earlier about whether we get a policy win or a political win and who takes it. And I think on the legal questions, Kevin, it's really fascinating because it is a political conundrum that Republicans, and maybe more so the president, are putting Democrats in to find money under the couch cushions, as you put it. But when you zoom out and it becomes bigger and not simply about one paycheck for active duty military, and it becomes a more fundamental question, then you do, I think, steel spines for Democrats on Article 1, because then you really get into a position of, okay, we are not only giving up our appropriations power of the purse, we're really kind of pointless. And I don't think that people run for Congress to be pointless. I don't think that you put in the effort to win a seat. Again, sitting next to Ron here, I can't imagine that you every 2 years for 26 years felt called to do something so that you could just do nothing. And I think that if the lawsuits and the pain points that start to exist go beyond what is narrow and easily digestible for a voter on the military, and then it starts to become, everybody or all these different agencies, you can start to imagine a Democratic leadership posture, and certainly certain senators, I would think even more than House members, feeling very uncomfortable with what their role becomes more permanently.
Yeah, I'm just going to emphasize what Allison's saying. Yeah, when I became very frustrated with the process, I could take refuge in the casework I was doing for constituents back home. But during a government shutdown, you're making calls that aren't being answered now. And that frustration keeps building, not only with you and your staff, because you can't do the good work that the constituents expect, but these problems aren't getting resolved. And then it really does feel like it's futile. And, what's the point of all this?
And the bad thing for, again, all of Congress with another year-long CR is congressmen don't get their earmarks for another year, which is a big deal, right? I mean, it's one of the most tangible things you can bring back to your district. Andy Harris had said, hey, I want to do a CR with earmark.
Yeah, totally not legal, but they were going to do it, and that's great.
Right.
Well, and ironically, look, some of the stealing of the spine that you mentioned for Democrats, if you go down the doomsday path, we could really be at this for a long time, because once you sort of break the seal on we're going to pay all these people once, you can justify paying them again and again. And ironically, I think this is some of the reason that Schumer voted in March to pass it the first time, was he didn't want to leave an unfettered Trump administration to figure out what they could do and to fill in the gaps. But let's get off the doomsday. Let's go back to we finally find that beautiful off ramp from this crisis, and we wake up, and we'll say it's November 4th or 5th that this happens. What can we expect out of a Congress that does come back and everybody's mad at everybody? There's a little bit of toxicity that has to clear, and Ron can talk about that experience. But Samantha, what are you hearing people hope to accomplish with the rest of 2025 if there's a deal?
I mean, it depends on what that deal looks like, right? Like if it's a CR on November 4th, we're still in a funding fight. They still have to figure out what to do on appropriations, get the NDAA over the finish line. That will be easy, or maybe not easy, but that will pass. There had been a lot of bipartisan hopes going into the fall, going into September, saying, hey, maybe we can do a bipartisan health package. Maybe we can get something small done on permitting reform. I don't see any appetite to do those after the shutdown fight, or time, frankly. If there is a funding deal and there is an omnibus funding package, which we're in a lot of hypotheticals at that point, right? Maybe they can attach some PBM reform, which may have to be there anyway to offset some ACA deal. But members aren't in town and talking about those things right now. So they would have a lot of time to make up on those negotiations as well.
They're not building all the ornaments to put on the Christmas tree,
Right.
Ron. So what about that toxicity that builds up in these shutdowns? How does that impact legislating to come, Ron?
Well, it doesn't help, obviously, because, again, you need to build those bonds of trust in order to reach agreements on tough issues. And there are some tough issues that the Congress is facing right now. And you go through a bitter shutdown, there's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of rhetoric that's being thrown around, and you just don't overcome that overnight. And again, that gets me back to, as quickly as possible, getting back to regular order and letting the committees do the work. And the most likely area to watch there is Senate appropriators, finally getting together, having those conversations, hammering out some agreements on a package deal that will last longer than just a short 2 or 3 months and carry us through the next year. But that's a lot of work in a short period of time with the holidays pressing. And so, again, the pressure is going to continue to build, and it's going to leave a lot of unfinished business, I think, at the end of the year. But in the meantime, office staff are still working. They're not getting paid. So there's still an opportunity for outreach on the Hill, knocking on doors in order to raise issues of concern for particular groups or constituents. And people should still be taking full advantage of that. But understanding you might be talking to some pretty ornery staff members who are working hard without getting paid.
Allison, that's a great segue to got a lot of clients that listen to the podcast, and a lot of them have been frustrated. They've been shut out of coming to Washington, D.C. at this time period because members aren't here, and maybe they're advocating at home through us. But what advice do you give to people that are playing the policy game in Washington here in the fourth quarter, before the shutdown, after the shutdown, and preparing for 2026?
Yeah, I think that the point about the lack of committee work is actually really interesting, and I think that clients should be tuned into that, because what could normally be happening at the end of this year will no doubt get kicked into next year. So while we would love to see lots of things finish on time and as expected, there is a window to continue those conversations into the winter now. Funding certainly, but also on other policy fights, right? I think that there was just a graphic up, maybe Punchbowl News even posted it, the House committee calendar, and the whole month was empty. And that's obviously a pretty rare sight for someone who follows subcommittee hearings. So I think that, not to be too glass half full or silver lining about it, there is going to be quite a lot of pent up work that has stalled at the committee just simply due to the fact that they've been called out of session. And normally little things would be occurring. So I think looking into the fall, to the winter from the fall, if you have bills that sit in front of certain subcommittees or main committees that we would want to attach, there does seem to be some kind of opportunity for us, maybe post-holidays, to talk to some of those less ordinary staffers and get some of those priorities pushed into early next year.
I feel like in many ways, clients are going to have to almost relaunch for advocacy campaigns like they would at the start of a Congress, because so many things have ground to a halt. But I want to go back to something Ron said earlier, which is that generally these shutdowns end early enough that they don't impact the election to come. And the speed of the Trump administration, none of us could list what the August top 5 controversies were there, because there are 50 controversies ago. And so maybe this will pass, but I do think the fact that we've had the fall that we've had creates a lot of incentive for congressional Republicans to figure out a big quarter 1 legislative priority, because the campaigning on the one big beautiful bill is going to feel pretty stale next summer if nothing else has been accomplished in the interim.
Yeah, I would agree, Kevin. And I think the one overriding message we hear from our clients every day is the lack of certainty or predictability of what's coming next. They're caught in this tariff regime, which is changing. It's on again, off again, almost on a 24-hour basis. That creates uncertainty. The government shutdown and when this is going to open and how these programs are going to function again creates that uncertainty. And that's the enemy to a growing, thriving economy and job hiring and trying to get costs down. And these are the issues that the typical American wakes up with every morning and has to deal with is, how's this impacting my pocketbook or businesses, and whether I can make that next hiring decision or not, or start laying people off. And if that continues to build going into next year, of course, it's going to be a pretty potent political force for the midterms.
All right, I'll put everyone on the spot as we wrap up here. This is official prediction time. Tell me when the shutdown's going to end. We all have pools, and I've already lost the Arnold and Porter pool. I was way, way off. So this is my new official guess, but I'm going to take November 5th as the date that we get a shutdown. Ron, what's your guess?
I think it's going to be a little bit later than that. I think one of the key dates is November 21. That's when that so-called CR that the House passed expires. And by then, you're going to have multiple paychecks that will have gone without being paid. So I'm thinking just before Thanksgiving.
Oh, I'm more optimistic than Ron. Okay, Allison, where do you land?
I was pretty much aligned with Ron in that sense. Very, very similar school of thought. I think that just to keep it fun, I'll say after Thanksgiving, because that's when everyone will lose their minds when they can't get on their planes home. And I think that is a true pressure point that actually permeates the public. And I think that if you're going to take it all the way to the 21st, that Democrats don't have a huge incentive to finish it prior to. You must force the House back. And I think you have to put Johnson on the spot to say, why didn't you bring us back earlier?
Wow, I'm still the most optimistic. Samantha?
I agree. My original pool, I had October 24th. I think we're going to blow through that this week. I'll say maybe November 23rd to put us on that Sunday right before Thanksgiving when big travel's coming up, and it's looking like that could be a mess.
Wow. Okay. So what you're hearing from 4 pseudo experts here at the table is that we're nowhere close to the shutdown ending. Let's hope we're all wrong. As we wrap up, Samantha, you do a great job at Punchbowl News. Why don't you give the audience a chance to follow you and tell them how they can connect with you? Want to share your handle and email?
Sure. My email is easy. It's Samantha@punchbowl.news, and my handle on X, formerly known as Twitter, is SN_handler. So reach out anytime.
Great. Well, we really appreciate you being our special guest today. We want to thank everyone for joining the podcast. If you want more information, visit us at the Arnold and Porter website, arnoldporter.com. Thanks, everybody.